Shabbat Shalom, everyone. As we look at the end of last week's Parsha into this week's Parsha, we see what I would describe as two very different methodologies to achieve change in our community. When we see something that is wrong, when we see something that is unjust, when we see something that is immoral, how do we respond to it? And the end of Balak into the beginning of Pinchas, we see the main protagonist of our Parsha, Pinchas. He sees two people, Zimri and Cosbi, doing things that are inappropriate inside of the Beit HaMikdash, inside of the tabernacle. Through a sense of zeal, he actually takes a spear and skewers both of them. Then, that is the end of last week's Parsha, actually. It kind of ends on that cliffhanger and then comes to this week's Parsha. And it says, as we turn to page 918, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying that Pinchas, the son of Eleazar, has turned back my wrath. God was angry at what was going on about this. He was going to come in and potentially destroy the people. And Pinchas, because of that act of zealotry, he turned back God's wrath. Therefore, verse 12, I grant him my pact of shalom. I don't know why it's called pact of friendship here. That's a really weird translation for Briti Shalom, my pact of peace, my pact of shalom. We all know that word. I don't know why they translate it as friendship. But that's the first model, right? He saw something that was wrong. He responded to it with decisive, clear action, even though that action, we're going to talk about it a little bit more, is problematic. And he was responded to with Brit Shalom, with a covenant of peace. So that's one model. The other model that comes from this week's Parsha are the daughters of Tzlofchad, right? The daughters of Tzlofchad, they are, in fact, the daughters of a gentleman by the name of Tzlofchad. He had no sons, and when it came to the inheritance, when he died, the inheritance was going to go back to the tribe. And the daughters came to Moses and said, this is not fair, this is not right. And they made a petition through the legal system, basically. In that case, it was Moses. Moses then actually went to God because he didn't know what the answer was. And God said, the daughters of Tzlofchad are right, they should get the inheritance. Two models of change, right? What are the pluses and minuses? What are the benefits and costs of these two models? Because the rabbis actually struggle with both of them. The rabbis struggle with both of them, right? We see at the end that the rabbis of the Talmud, in Sanhedrin, actually, in the Talmud, the rabbis say that if Pinchas wouldn't have caught them in that act itself, he would have been convicted of murder. Right? It was the fact that he actually caught them after the fact, though, he would have been convicted of murder. But the action in and of itself was a problem. And we find out later on that, yes, the daughters of Tzlofchad were able to get this, but later on in the Torah, it gets rolled back a little bit. That's not entirely true. It doesn't always work out that way. So there's problems with both. What are the pluses and minuses of each of these paradigms for how to make social change happen, how to make change in our world happen? What do you think? Sophia? Okay, so if God can change God's mind, then we can change our minds. And how does that tie into into these two different models, which one do you think then that works best for? Well, either way. Well, so I would argue and say, yes, that the model of sort of judicial process, right, which is what we got with the daughters of Tzlofchad, allow for people to think through, change their minds, have a conversation, have a discussion, whereas the model of Pinchas, there is no discussion, right? He saw, he acted, period. He didn't go through the courts, he didn't go through anything else. He saw, he acted. Okay, good. What else? Pluses and minuses of these two models. Mm-hmm. So perhaps that what you're arguing, I'm going to rephrase what you're saying a little bit. What you're arguing is that maybe Pinchas isn't a model for everything. It was very specific as being a passion for God and for what God needs, and if it were just for something else, well, you couldn't do it that way. You couldn't do it that way. Look, I think, let me reframe it a little bit. Let me reframe it into more sociologically and socially acceptable terms, right? Civil rights movement, right? Civil rights movement. There were multiple ways of trying to get change during that era, right? Some, I would say, were modeled after Tzlofchad and her daughters. It was through legislation. It was by trying to get the laws changed. It was by trying to work through the court system. All of those sorts of things were happening, right? And some of them were through marches and protests. Now, that's not obviously skewering to people, right? It's certainly more within the realm, but those are the mindsets that we're talking about here. Is it a mindset of action? I need to go out and I need to do something. Or is it a mindset of process? Right? That's what I see in this part in this part of the Torah. Varda.
Well, I'm reminding now about this very, especially with what's going on now in Israel, a very famous quote by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who said that real change and lasting change happens one step at a time. And that is something to keep in mind in this context too, because certainly what Pinchas did was not one step at a time. He just went all the way to the end and just eliminated the people that he disapproved of, whereas the women here are negotiating and hoping, and as you were saying, the rabbis later on detracted from what they agreed on. They said, well, not always. I mean, in other words, you go forward 3 steps, you go back 2 steps, and then forward 3 steps, and that is a model that sometimes, when it brings the entire community together to accept and understand, is a lasting model that stays.
Yes. Varda, I think you said that very eloquently. I agree with you. For those people who are at home and who didn't hear you, what Varda said is, she actually quoted Ruth Bader Ginsburg, that change is something that happens one step at a time, that it's a process. And what Pinchas did here was not a process. It was a leap, not a bunch of different steps. But at the same time, and I agree with everything you're saying, but I'm also going to say the challenge with it, it's hard. And it's frustrating. Because all the work that Tzlofchad's daughter did, and then later on, the rabbis say, it's actually the Torah that says later on, and then the rabbis pick on it, well, not all the time. Well, wait a second, we just did all that work, and we moved the needle this far, and now it's gone back. And I have to say that I'm hearing that frustration, and I've been hearing it for a while, both here in the United States and in Israel, where we've made so much progress and now we're going back. Pick your cause. Like, I don't want to get political in terms of this cause or that cause, but we're hearing that frustration, that this process of work doesn't always go in our favor, and it doesn't always go ahead, and there's moments that are very difficult and very frustrating. It seems to be a lot easier, a lot more efficient just to be Pinchas and say, this is what it is. This is what we're going to do. And people, by the way, I would argue, have started doing that, right? People have started doing that. You could argue that some of the challenges that are happening both here in the States and in Israel are because some people have said, I'm going to make this decision unilaterally, and I'm going to change all of this. And that's part of what we're struggling with. Good. What else? What else are the pros and cons of these models that we have here? Jeff? So Jeff, you said two things that I think were important. I'm going to actually split them. You said at the first part, you mentioned extenuating circumstances, which I actually think is a little different than what you were saying towards the end, and I'll tell you why. Extenuating circumstances, obviously one could argue that Pinchas and what was going on was extenuating circumstances, right? It's not something that happens often, right? We have a couple of things here. So I'm going to let you read for yourself as we get there what was going on and the context of it instead of saying it out loud, right? So there were clearly extenuating circumstances of what was going on inside of the tabernacle to make Pinchas respond the way that he did. That's different than the second part, which I think is also really important, and that is how change happens because the world has changed, not in an extenuating circumstance. The world has changed. And Jewish law and any legal system that's been around for an extended period of time has got to have mechanisms for adaptability and change, right? When I was working for a long time on biomedical ethics, when I was working in the hospital, right, the questions we were talking about were not anything that the rabbis of the Talmud could have dreamed up in their wildest dreams. And yet we still had to try and derive from those values, from those earlier ideas, what are we going to do now? Right? How are we going to define death in today's day and age when they didn't have the same tools that we have today? Does that make a difference? We now know how to do CPR. Well, you can't say that cessation of cardiac functions means death because otherwise nobody's going to do CPR. Person's dead. We know that to be different. Things change, and so the law has to change as well. And maybe, Jeff, what you're getting at here is one of the reasons, or one of the understandings of these two models. That one model is more appropriate in extenuating circumstances, in what we would call, in Jewish legal terms, shat hadchak, or a time of distress or tension or emergency, right? But you would argue differently if there weren't those extenuating circumstances. This came up, actually, and we had this discussion in the Beit Midrash class. This came up about Zoom minions during COVID. And the conservative movement issued a ruling, which, as you know, I disagreed with for a number of different reasons, right? But saying that COVID was a shat hadchak, was an extenuating circumstance. And therefore, we could alter the law, we can respond differently during this period of time than we would have otherwise. So I think there's very much something to be said for that.
I think like, your example here, as opposed to what Pinchas did, to me, what Pinchas did was vigilante justice.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is when someone thinks they're so right that they do something that's wrong, they can justify it. And it bothers me that that was considered justified because of the actions that went on there, as opposed to, no, you should have reported this and let the justice system take care of it.
Right.
So what your example of the doing the Zoom meetings and stuff, that was a consensus. That was a group discussion. Not everyone's going to agree with it, but at least it was a group discussion and then a general follow, as opposed to one person taking the matter in their own hands and saying this is right.
Yeah, I mean, I understand what you're saying. What Mark was saying is there's a difference between a single person really acting as a vigilante and taking justice into their own hands versus in an emergency situation, still somewhat of a process of people coming together saying, okay, we're going to do this in this situation. I mean, and Judaism has a history of changing law in emergency situations. We know that. There is a huge area of study in Jewish law about law during the Holocaust. What can you do? What can you not do? Right? If you don't have candles, can you say a bracha on 2 matches for Shabbat? What if the only challah you can get is challah that you've stolen? Are you allowed to say a blessing over that? Right? So there's a whole area of law that comes during these times. But as you're saying, those laws are more consensus-based. It's not just a single person acting on the spur of the moment. They are thought through and worked through, and maybe that's a difference that we have between what Pinchas did here and between what we might do in today's day and age. Good, Mark. Anybody else? Nancy. Go ahead. So it's a very good question. So Nancy asked, what happens when the extenuating circumstance is over? So that is exactly the conversation that's happening right now as people, I mean, we still have people who are watching us online. Well, the quote unquote, at least the World Health Organization has declared that the threat is over, but we still, our Beit Midrash class is still meeting via Zoom instead of meeting back all together again because the extenuating circumstance became the norm. It became comfortable. And people have said, well, I don't have a problem being together with other people, but I would just much rather do class from my house. It's a lot easier. I don't have to schlep down. I don't have to drive at night. I don't have to worry about the kids. Whatever, fill in your blank, right? That is a major issue of when the extenuating circumstance is over, now what do you do? And there becomes this normatization of the extenuating, of the processes during the extenuating circumstances that now we have to either try to undo or it becomes the new norm. And we're absolutely struggling with that right now, after COVID and based on that. Milt.
I'm going to step out a little bit and say a word in defense of Pinchas.
Go ahead, please, defend Pinchas.
He was the officer, he was, in essence, a sworn officer. He was the chief of guard.
He was a leader, correct.
He did what he thought was his responsibility to protect the sanctity of the Aron Kodesh. And he was then, like any officer, if an officer today shoots someone, and the question is, was it justified? He's brought before the authorities. In this case, the authority was God.
Right.
He said that was the right thing.
So what Milt is arguing in defense of Pinchas, he was a sworn officer officer, he was one of the leaders of the people and the leader of his tribe, certainly.
Well, the leader, it says the leader of the guard.
Yes.
So he was actually in charge of
Yeah.
the sanctity of the.
He was in charge of it. Nobody else. And some of the Midrashim go so far as to say he actually looked over and saw that neither Moses nor Aaron were doing anything about it. Right? So those people who are trying to defend Pinchas frame it that way, to say he was waiting for the appropriate leaders to take action. They weren't, so he took action. Right? Now, the question is, was that action justified, right, to kill two people? He could have gone in, he could have brought them out, he could have had them arrested, he could have brought them before God for trial. There's a lot, right? That act of zealotry, and that's why I think both the rabbis and the Torah struggle with it. What is his gift, right? What is his gift? Brit Shalom. Now, the reason I have a problem with translating as the covenant of friendship or a gift of friendship is because the rabbis pick up on Brit Shalom and said that was actually protection that God offered him. Because he should have been held liable and accountable for killing these two people. Right? And God actually then stepped in and said, I'm going to protect you from that. Right? It's the equivalent of going to a sanctuary city. And therefore, he's protected. But that's why it was a Brit Shalom, because the relatives of these two could have come and said, I want revenge. You killed them, and you weren't justified for that. Therefore, the gift was a gift of protection. It wasn't actually a gift of saying you were right. It was a gift of saying, I'm going to protect you. Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, but that's still in front of everybody and it's before the Lord, right? It's part of a process. There's no doubt that what Cosby and Zimri did was completely against the law and was actually, if they were charged and gone through due process, it's a capital crime. The question is, Pinchas made that decision without due process. Potentially. I don't know.
So maybe this entire lesson is really not so much about whether what Pinchas did was okay or not okay, but that God made a decision, you just mentioned that bloodletting through revenge would not happen here. Yes, he did. Maybe it was questionable. We're not sure. In some eyes it's okay. In some eyes it's not okay. However, I will not allow those relatives to go after this man and to continue with this bloodletting.
Right.
And will stop that right now and have brit bait, as we say, which is a concept in Judaism
Right.
for peaceful family, so to speak. You forgive quite a lot or you let go of quite a lot, rather than the cycle of we will kill you and then you'll kill us and we'll go on.
Right. We have the Hatfields and the McCoys, and everybody kills each other.
Maybe it's about really God's best.
That's possible, Varda.
We're not going to continue to kill people.
That's possible, right? And just to repeat what Varda said was that perhaps it's God's brit here, that God's covenant was not so much about saying this was a right thing to do, but God was just stopping the cycle or preventing the cycle of violence that would have happened from the revenge and from the killings and stuff like that potentially could have come after that, and possibly even by the way of war, because now we're dealing with other nations as well, although we were technically at war with them anyway. Anybody else before I kind of bring this to a close? Yeah, Jeff. Yeah, look, here's what I would say. I would love to say that the daughters of Zelophehad are really this paradigm of egalitarianism. It's a step, but it's very small, because it's not saying that women and men are equal. What it's saying is, if there are no men around, at least the women should get it, right? And so it's a little bit of a different statement than saying that they're truly equal. But what I like about it is that the women, even though they didn't get everything that they wanted, the women actually had a voice, right? And women in Judaism, by the way, even though there is in ancient Judaism, both in the Bible and the Talmud, there is an inequality in that, certainly vis-a-vis how we see it today, no doubt. What is clear is that women in our tradition always have a voice. Even if they don't have the ability, even if they don't have the agency, that's the word I'm looking for. They may not have agency, but they have a voice. And we see that through the matriarchs and how they worked through our text. We see that here with the daughters of Zelophehad. We see that with Miriam, right? We see that going all the way through, even in the time of the Talmud, with Bruria and some of these figures who, Bruria couldn't make legal rulings, but she told some of those students what was what, right? And she told them they were wrong, and they didn't understand the text, and the Talmud said she was right. They were wrong. So it's this idea, what I will say about the daughters of Zelophehad is it shows that women have a voice, even if they don't have agency all the way through. And I think that's important. That's very, very important, because in other cultures, there's neither agency nor voice, and that's where it gets very, very dangerous, right? Very dangerous. So my sum up is, we've got two different paradigms here for how to do change, right? We've got change of action and change of process, right? I'm going to go out, I'm going to say the process, and by the way, action usually happens, or should happen, when process isn't functioning, right? And that's, I think, what Pinchas felt. Let's take your argument. God said all these people should be brought out and they should be killed and they should be impaled, right, for doing this. He's looking around and he's saying, nothing's happening. Process has failed. Therefore, I'm going to take action. I think we see that in the civil rights movement as well. Process has failed, therefore action has to happen. I'll get to you one second. I would say we see that in Israel right now with the protests, right? When I was there, I was at some of the protests talking to people. I said, why are you here? They said, because the process is broken. Therefore, we have to be here. Ethan. He may have been. Some rabbis, so let me just, I'll repeat what you said so people can hear. Ethan asked a good question. Do we think that Pinchas was aware that if he didn't take this action, that there would have been, God's wrath would have been against the people, there could have been a lot more deaths, could have been a lot, and this, he saw his action as protecting the people, right? And there are a lot of rabbis in the Talmud who say that's exactly the case, right? That's why he actually stepped in. And some of them call Moses and Aaron to task on it. They didn't do what they needed to do. They didn't step in. And so he stepped in to prevent God's wrath. Yes, it's very possible, in which case decisive action is necessary, right? Is necessary. To save lives, to do that, absolutely. He's a hero, but the question is, did Did he have to do what he did? Could he have taken action that was less extreme? And we're to some degree, we're all playing Monday morning quarterback here because we don't know, right? We don't know if he would have taken an action that was less extreme, if that would have worked and would have brought back God's wrath or not. But that's what the rabbis are struggling with afterwards. He has, so I don't know that it's the approval of God, it's the protection of God. Because again, breach shalom, it's a very unusual term. Nobody else has gotten this, right? It's very unusual. This isn't something that happens all the time. This isn't a phrase that refers to, a connection with God or a covenant with God. We don't see that anywhere else. This is really the only place where we talk about it. And it's a very unique circumstance. And so I think the rabbis are saying, this isn't just, oh, everything's okay. This is God saying, you're going to have peace, and I'm going to impose that, because otherwise things would have gotten very messy. All right. Something to think about. As we read through our section today, we're not going to read the daughters of Tzlofchad, that's in the middle part, but we are going to read this first part about Pinchas and the response to that. So let's open up to the beginning of Pinchas on 9:18.